Hello students, my name is Liz Attia and today's topic is the ethical theory of consequentialism. So, consequentialism. So, consequentialism is ethics based on fairness of outcomes. That is, the rightness or wrongness of an act is based solely on the consequences of performing that act. So remember, deontology actually focused on the action itself. Consequentialism is almost the opposite of that in terms of considering the ethical value. So it's not the act itself that's the focus, but rather the consequences or the effect. So consequentialists consider all the feasible alternative actions in a case. They consider all the possible consequences and then they choose the action that has the best consequence. So the pros and the cons of acting in particular ways are considered, and you'll note that we tend to actually do this quite intuitively when we're making decisions, competing decisions, and we're not quite sure what to do. We consider the consequences, we consider the risks, and we outweigh, based on the different alternatives, what the pros and the cons are. So they might argue, for example, a case in point when we're looking at the ethical application, they might argue that killing is justifiable in certain circumstances. So an act is ethical if it does more good than harm, and the motive is largely irrelevant. So it doesn't matter what the intentions are of the individuals involved, it's the consequences or the effect of that action. Noting that there might well be some harm that results, but the value, the good that comes out of that takes precedence and it outweighs any negative impact. So I guess just consider what circumstances a consequentialist might argue that killing is ethical. What might consequentialists decide regarding female genital mutilation? They might argue, for example, that a minor form of FGM under surgical conditions might protect women from the major form of FGM. So such a procedure might protect women from serious complications of illegal procedures done by unqualified practitioners in unhygienic conditions and backyard procedures. They might argue that it protects women from being ostracised in their community, from being isolated. Alternatively, they could argue that the consequence of any form of FGM is serious and therefore it must be avoided and that the harm outweighs the good. So clearly, you'll actually note that consequentialism will differ depending upon which stakeholders you actually consider in terms of being impacted by the decision as well. What are some of the advantages of consequentialism? Well, it reminds us that the consequences of our actions have moral significance and must be taken into account. So this idea that action in and of itself is right or wrong, in a consequentialist perspective, would actually be superficial because clearly all action has an effect and that effect must be considered. The case in point there is for you to actually consider who should get organ donation as an example. Some of the criticisms of consequentialism is in order to actually really give weight to this consequentialist theory in its true form, we need to have evidence, we need to have data, we need to have some objective standards to be able to assess the pros and the cons. And clearly, we know from our previous study in our practice that data might be incomplete, it might be subject to bias, and we can't always rely on the integrity of the information and the data that's being presented to us. So in a cost-benefit analysis, important information is often missing on either the costs or the benefits. So we have an incomplete picture that we're basing our decision on. Further, it's not always possible to predict the consequences. Regardless of the problems with gathering the data to begin with, sometimes the consequences are unknown. So we're looking almost, while we can have predictive value, the actual consequences are uncertain and therefore it's difficult to actually know with any level of guarantee what the consequences would actually be. We can predict, we can foresee not foresee, we can, with some foreseeability, we can actually try to assess what those implications would be based on past history or based on evidence-based practice. But really, there's always a degree of uncertainty until the consequences are actually known through the action. So we're caught in this bit of a dilemma. We can't assess the consequences until the decision is made, but we need the consequences to know what to do. So that becomes intrinsically complicated. The other criticism or critique of consequentialism is that reasoning risks marginalising those not in the majority. What does that mean? Well, if we actually look at consequentialism as being the greatest good for the greatest number of people, what does that mean then about the interests of the minority? Utilitarianism is often criticised for being blind to distributive considerations. A maximising approach implies that we're indifferent between health benefits to, say, the poor and the rich, as long as these benefits have the same impact on overall population health. What are we saying there? We're actually saying, well, listen, if you're going to be looking at the consequences and you're looking at the greatest consequences for the greatest number of people, then by virtue of that, you're marginalising minority groups because they're not the majority. And is that in and of itself ethical? The third critique is it may lead to morally indefensible consequences such as torture, death, imprisonment. So based on that same reasoning, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, you might well end up justifying action which in and of itself must be deemed to be unethical, such as capital punishment or torture or murder. And based on a consequentialist theory, that could be well justified, but really, is that something that sits well with us in terms of our human nature? Thank you, students. That brings today's topic to an end.